If you want to learn how a 2000 Elo player plays the Caro Kann Defense, then this is the video for you. My name is Alex, and I'm a 2000 rated over-the-board chess player, and in this series we're playing rapid games on chess.com, going from 1000 to 2000 Elo, and during the games I'll be explaining my thought process as best as I possibly can for your education and entertainment. Today's opponent, Jesus Petri from Brazil. Now, he actually opened with d4, and I like to play c6 rather than d5 immediately to encourage my opponent to go for the Caro Kann. And of course, we are going to play a Caro Kann defense. Now, I'm kind of hoping that my opponent goes for knight to c3, because I've recently been learning the Gurgenitsa variation with g6. He goes for the advance, and the advance is what typically gets played at this rating level. And I'm going to play c5 to immediately challenge the center, and most people follow up with c3 here, which is a bit of an inaccurate move. I think the reason that people tend to do it, there we go, is because you build a big pawn chain and it looks pretty. You win connect 4. That's not what chess is about, unfortunately. Better for white is to play knight to f3, and if I go knight to c6, not play c3, but play bishop b5, pinning my knight. Now, white's position is still fine, but knight f3 is an inaccuracy. Like I said, you have to pin my knight, because now what's going to happen is I'm going to get everything I've ever wanted. We're going to take, and this looks like white has secured his center, but the d4 pawn is incredibly weak now that we've removed the c3 pawn from play, and the knight can't take on d4 because that would hang the e5 pawn. So now, we're going to get every single benefit of the Caro Kann, because we're going to play bishop to g4, we're going to pin the knight to the queen, which applies a lot of pressure to d4. My opponent unpins. This is, I believe, the best move, but it's also a bit passive, right? Bishop b5 is a bit more aggressive, but I think bishop b2 is actually a perfectly fine move. And now, we're going to play e6, which, of course, secures our d5 pawn, prepares to bring our knight to e7, and then probably to f5 to apply more pressure to the d4 pawn. Our bishop can come to e7. My opponent goes a3, which you actually do see a lot in these Caro Kann lines, but my plan is never to put a bishop or a knight on b4. If my bishop was on f5, then maybe I'd want to put a knight on b4, but it's not, it's on g4. So this doesn't really do anything. We're going to play knight to e7, and the ideal setup in the Caro Kann really is the bishop on g4, the knight on f5, the knight on c6, pawns on d5 and e6, and then we bring the bishop to e7. Now my opponent plays bishop to g5, which is a little bit annoying because of course we can't move our knight because we would hang our queen. But what bishop to g5 no longer does is it no longer defends the b2 pawn. So we're going to play queen to b6, which attacks b2, attacks d4, and unpins our knight. I will link two playlists below, actually. So one of them will be the playlist with all the previous episodes of this speedrun series, so check those out after the video if you're interested. And the other playlist will be every single game I've played on my channel in the Caro Kann defense. And I think actually maybe episode 15 or something of the speedrun, we had kind of the ideal Caro Kann setup with like bishop on g4, knight on c6, and this knight coming to f5. Now, I think we can probably just win a pawn here. You could argue that you could play knight to f5, because this pawn is going to fall regardless. But I kind of like the fact that the king is currently in the center. Now, my opponent has played a3 and b4. b4 is, of course, played so that b2 no longer hangs. But I don't think this is the correct approach whatsoever. I think these are kind of a waste of time. We'll find out after the game what the computer would have recommended, but I think just take. And we have pressure on the rook, we're offering a queen trade, and we're going to win the e5 pawn if white does nothing, right? Like I say, yes, we could play knight to f5, but I kind of like the knight being on e7, because if this knight ends up on d4 or e5, then we can bring the other knight to c6 if we want. So we're a bit more flexible there, and we just allow my opponent to take on e7 if he wants to, which of course we would gladly welcome, because our dark squared bishop would then be unopposed, and because we've got all these pawns on light squares, our dark squared bishop is a very important piece to plug the holes. So we're going to take on f3, and my opponent of course has to take back, he's got nothing better, and we're going to play queen to d4. The reason I'm playing queen to d4 instead of knight to d4 is because it forces a queen trade, because our queen was also hitting the rook and also hitting the e5 square. Now, we have pressure on the bishop, we're threatening knight to c2 check, winning the rook outright, because it would be a fork, obviously. If my opponent castles here, I think we can just take the bishop with check and ruin the pawn structure. So bishop d1 is probably the best move. No longer can I take your bishop, and you also protect c2. I'm very tempted just to play knight to c6, attacking the e4 pawn. Sorry, the e5 pawn. Maybe knight g6, though, because we attack the pawn still. We don't get in the way of this knight potentially retreating. And another bonus is that bishop to f4 can't be played because we now control that square. However, I think it would be a little bit annoying if we play a move like knight g6 and the bishop gives a check on a4. Although no, then we have b5 protected by our knight, so that should be fine. That should be fine. Maybe knight e to c6 is better. I mean, if bishop to f4, I don't think that's an issue. I mean, there's even ideas of g5, trying to drag the bishop away and set up rook g8 ideas. Or then I suppose f4 would defend, so maybe after g5, bishop takes something like knight takes e5, and then knights get very active, and rook g8 still exists, and our bishop's going to come to d6, which will be a very nice square. That's very tempting. We could, of course, throw in the move h6 here, and just ask the bishop what it's doing, but then I think the bishop would go to e3, but then I suppose we'd have knight to f5, and remember, we're already up a pawn, so we don't have to be too greedy here. And if my opponent castles, then of course we just take on e3 and ruin his pawn structure. So he'd probably have to trade with us. And then we just have a powerful knight. But then we do have opposite coloured bishops, which is a little bit drawish. Now we could just play rook c8. We could just play rook c8. And delay our plans for the time being, because we know we're going to put the rook on c8. And if our opponent moves the bishop, we even have ideas of infiltrating on the c8 square, which is interesting. We're maybe trying to play knight c2 and exchange the bishop for the rook. Sorry, the bishop for the knight. Maybe this is a very powerful knight, so I'm not sure about that. There is a shout to play a6. It's a useful move, and it supports b5 if we ever want to play it, so that a bishop to a4 isn't a problem. All of those are viable moves. I think my favourite is knight e to c6, though. I think that's my favourite move out of the lot. So I'm going to play it. And if bishop to f4, I like the look of g5. And if the bishop goes back to g3, we can play h5. We can play bishop g7, applying more pressure. It all looks pretty good. We could even just play bishop e7 and offer a trade of bishops, and it's impossible for my opponent to refuse, which, to be honest, might be the best idea. Let me think. If h6, bishop h4, we can play g5, and if take, we can take on e5, but that feels a little bit flimsy because of moves like bishop to f6. So I think, because we have two knights, and my opponent only has one knight, it makes sense to trade a pair of bishops so my opponent no longer has the bishop pair. I think that makes perfect sense. Now, do I take with the king or the knight? If I take with the knight can access f5, which is maybe useful. If I take with the king, our knight stays a bit further up the board. Our king is ideally placed on e7 because it can't be checked because it's on a dark square, and our rooks get connected immediately. My only thing is, these knights feel superfluous. Superfluous meaning, like, they kind of do the same thing. Like, I would prefer this knight to be taken by something so I could replace it. I'm going to take with the king. And we have this geometry that I often talk about. If you guys have been watching the channel for a while, then you'll know what I'm about to say. Between the bishop and the knight, there's 2 squares between them. So the bishop kind of controls my knight's forward movement. But then in another sense, my knight also controls my opponent's bishop's forward movement. So it's an interesting dynamic between those 2 pieces. By the way, if you're this far in the video and you're finding this educational and even maybe a bit entertaining, then I'd really appreciate it if you could drop a like and subscribe down below. Really helps to motivate me keep making these videos for you guys. And okay, moves like b5 are interesting. Trying to take some space. I don't know, a4 is maybe encouraged then. Because a4 can't be played because he'll hang the b4 pawn. So maybe not. We could put this knight on f5 and try and get into e3. That also frees up the d4 square for this knight. But I think we can also do that whenever we want. I think I'd rather play rook a to c8. I think I'd rather do that. Okay, my opponent blitzes out the move knight c3. My opponent's been playing very fast this game. I don't really understand. Now, I was going to say knight to b4 and have to take, but then a7 hangs. Note the fact that my rook is obviously x-raying this knight. I think it's better to take on e5. However, my opponent can throw in knight takes d5 check in all of those lines. Now, if the knight takes on b4, this can't be thrown in because we can take back. But if our knight takes on e5, then it can. And we get this position. And I don't love that because we've just weakened our d-pawn. Currently, it's a protected passed pawn. Then it would just be an isolated passed pawn. If we play knight to b4, knight takes d5 doesn't work. So pawn takes b4. Rook takes c3, rook takes a7. I don't love that because b7 is very tender there. And that feels unnecessary to allow. So we could start with a move like knight to f5. And g4 is a bit questionable because of knight to e3. So let's say knight to f5 and my opponent plays a move like rook to f3. Then we can maybe hop the other knight in and harass the rook a bit. That's interesting because then the knight will also be under attack. I'm going to play knight to f5. Also, the reason I left this rook on h8 rather than playing rook h to c8 is because I mentioned before I played the move rook a to c8 that I liked ideas of knight to f5 in the future. But one of the things you have to be aware of in French and Caro Kann structures where the knight often goes to the f5 square is that g4 can often be an issue, trying to kick your knight out. So I like having the option of playing h5. Okay, my opponent plays bishop to a4, but now I think we can take on b4. Because, of course, if knight takes d5, we just take back with the knight and we're up a piece. And if knight takes b4, a takes b4, rook takes c3, there is no rook takes a7 because the bishop is in the way. So I'm going to play it. Knight takes b4. Dynamite strike, we win a pawn. Now, we are already up a pawn, of course, so now we're up 2 pawns. Knight b5. Okay. That doesn't... I mean, it attacks a7, I suppose, but can't I just play knight c6? And you can't do this, but maybe on knight c6, my opponent wants g4, trying to dislodge my knight from the d6 square. Interesting. Well, I think we have knight to e3 there, counter-attacking the rook, and forking the g4 pawn. That is pretty good. We could be going up 3 pawns there, so even if he does win a7, we'll be up 3 pawns, so I don't care. We could play a6, but after take, my opponent gets a pawn back, and we're only up 1 pawn, and we're still probably winning, but less winning. Is there any other options? Like, we could play a move like knight c2, counter-attacking the rook, but after take... Oh, no, the rook doesn't go to c1, the rook goes to c7. I am messing my arrows up massively. Knight takes a7. Yeah, I don't really want to allow that. So let's just play knight c6. I think g4 is the only way for white to try and fight for equality. Because if white plays a lazy move, like, I don't know, rook f3, let's say, stopping my knight from getting to the e3 square. I mean, for a start, we might have knight f to d5 there, or rook c1, I think also doesn't work, because now we just play a6. Now we just play a6. And the knight gets kicked out, right? And now the knight has no hope of infiltrating d6, because my opponent didn't have time to kick my knight away because he played rook a to c1. Now I like the look of the move b5, kicking the bishop away. Yeah, let's do it. So we have, well, we have a passed pawn on the d file, which we can push at any time. But for now, it's nicely protected on d5, so there's not really any rush. We have ideas of knight to e3 at all times, or even knight to d4. And it makes it very hard for this bishop, because these are all its escape squares, right, to stop itself from getting potentially traded off. If we do manage to trade that bishop off for one of our knights, then all of the imbalance in the position will be gone. The only imbalance right now, of course we're up 2 pawns, right? But white has a bishop, and all of our pawns are on light squares, because of course it's a Caro Kann, that's what tends to happen. So I guess his only hope is that his bishop can somehow pick up a pawn or two. I was kind of expecting this. It doesn't do anything. He creates a passed pawn, sure, but the bishop doesn't do anything on b5. I think we just go knight to d4. Do we put this knight on d4? No, we put this knight on d4. Yeah. We offer a trade of rooks, and we attack the bishop. So my opponent will be forced to trade something. However, if he does retreat the bishop, I don't really want to take. Because if takes, I can't play rook c8 challenging his rook, so then he gets the c-file, and he'll probably play a move like rook c7. Now, I suppose you could play something like take, rook d8, and if rook c7, go rook d7, but it feels like I'm giving my opponent an unnecessary amount of things there. There is also ideas of knight to e2 check, if this bishop ever takes the knight. So I'm tempted to play the move king d7, and just prepare take, and rook c8. And if king d7, bishop f5, then we can just play knight to e2 check and ignore the bishop. And you can never give this check because our knight defends that square. And also what I like about this position, what I like is that, you know how previously I was criticizing my knights for being superfluous? Here, they have a really nice connection because of the surplus. I don't even know how to say it. Surplus. What's it? I'm chatting utter BS. Don't listen to me. Don't listen to me. Superfluousness, I suppose. Let's go rook b8. Let's offer a trade of rooks again. Again, this can't be played because I control this square twice. And this a-pawn isn't very scary. It isn't very scary. I mean, I suppose my knights would struggle to get to the a-file, because knights, of course, are very slow compared to bishops. But I think it should be fine. Knight e3 could be considered. Rook e1. The rook has to stay on the first rank, really. Or I suppose the bishop does defend. Knight to e3. Rook e1. We could play knight e to c2, attacking the rook again. Again, encouraging a trade, which I would love. If the rook goes to c1 instead, declining the trade, then we have knight to b4, attacking the bishop. And we're also getting ready to help with the defense. We could bring this knight to c6, and then they would connect very nicely. We could, of course, trade rooks, like I say, but if take, we can't play rook to b8 because it's not a defended square. We could bring the knight back, but then my opponent gets the b5 square for the bishop, which I don't really want to give him, although this knight could replace the other knight. All interesting stuff. All interesting stuff. Maybe I should play this. Maybe I should bring the knight back to c6. And if bishop b5, go knight f to d4. I like it. Because we're stopping the advance of the pawn, right? We're also facilitating take, and rook to b8, because our knight will be defending the b8 square. If all the rooks come off the board, then the game is over, because it's 2 knights versus a bishop. Yeah, okay, my opponent takes on f5, but that doesn't really help him. It doesn't help him at all, because this pawn structure looks ugly, sure. Yes, you can attack here, but I think I just go king to e6, right? Or no, actually I can push the pawn. What am I on about? I can just push. Yeah, let's push. And now white has a bit of a problem on his hands, because my knight is stopping this pawn from advancing. It's also defending d4. Maybe he could have played a5 to try and deflect my knight and then take on d4, but if a5, I take the rook first, and then I take on a5, and the game is over. Also stopping rook to b2, which is very, very nice. Rook a1 is played, which makes a lot of sense. We could try and bring our king, but I think we should probably get both our rooks involved first. We could play rook a8, but it feels passive. I think I prefer rook b4. Attacking, defending, and x-raying the f4 pawn. If my opponent pushes, then we go rook a8, and then the pawn is probably lost. If the pawn goes to a6, we bring the rook back to b6, and if it pushes again, we just trade. So I'm going to play rook b4. Rook b4 is also good, because we're closing the d file here, the knight closing the c file, our rook's closing the b file, and this pawn is closing the a file. So let's go rook a8. Now all of our pieces are involved in the game. Previously, the rook was over on h8, of course. My opponent pushes a6, but I think we just go rook b6. And there is no way for my opponent to defend the pawn a second time. He can push it, and he could argue, well, if I push and take, he does, and if take, then he has rook takes d4. And we could play king e6 there and play out that endgame. But I don't think we need to settle for that. I think we can just go rook b7 and maintain our defense of the d4 pawn. And now, if something like take, then it's even more winning, because we get the same kind of position as before, except we've got a passed d pawn. I'm actually going to take with this rook rather than the a rook, because my opponent can't take on d4, of course. He'll just lose another exchange, and then he'll be down a whole rook rather than just down a knight. But this is great, because there's no rook b4, so our knight controls that square. And if rook c6, what would you play? After rook c6, sorry, rook c4, where did I get 6 from? If rook c4, what would you play? He goes for it. I think rook to a1 is by far the best move. Or at least the easiest move. I think it's the easiest move. Again, if some kind of... He can't even do that because the rook's pinned to the king. But let's say he could. Like, take. Then we would just be up a rook. So, it's not of concern at all. Let's just throw in a check. Try and... I don't know. Yeah, I suppose the king's a bit cut off now on g3. I think we just push. We just push. The king's a little bit cut off. And the rook can't give a check on d4 because our knight controls that square. e6 does nothing. Rook goes to c3. But then we just push d2, defended by our rook. The rook gives the check, yes. Don't go to e6 and hang the knight. Although I suppose if king e6, rook d6, king e7, and rook takes c6, then we promote. But if king e6, rook check, and king back to e7, my opponent can just not take, and he can bring his king over. Although the king can never go on the second rank, because I will promote. So the king has to get to e2 if it wants to get to the second rank, because then he can take after I promote, because it comes with discovered check. So king e7 is the move I'm going to go for. And now what? Now what? Well, now he just blunders this. Now he blunders it. It's discovered check. And it's game over. My opponent resigns in this position, and a very, very solid Caro Kann game. I mean, we kind of just got everything that we could ever want in the Advance Caro Kann, you know? We got... Well, it actually started out as potentially a Slav defense, but my opponent transposed to a Caro Kann, which is why I play c6 on my first move. Goes for the advance, and like I said, watch the eval bar. You can see it on the screen. After c3, it goes down a little bit. Knight c6. After knight f3, it's now in my favour. Power of the Caro Kann, because c3 and knight f3 are such intuitive moves, just defending the d4 pawn, which I'm putting pressure on. But the Caro Kann isn't that simple for white to deal with. Let's get into the analysis. So, I told you at the start of the video to watch this if you want to see how to play the Caro Kann like a 2000 Elo player. Game review gives us 95.1% accuracy. And that's over 40 moves, which is tough to get over 40 moves. Like, say you play like a 15-20 move game and you win, then it's not so difficult. But over 40 moves, that's tough. That's tough. So, okay. The opening, d4. So, what I tend to play against the queen's pawn opening is I go c6, and most people will play like c4, d5, and we'll go into a Slav. Or if they want to play a London, like bishop f4, and then I'll go for this whole d5 thing, although apparently queen b6 is good here. Just going after this pawn immediately. I've never actually knew that queen b6 was the best move there. Queen c1 defending, and then... Is this like a perk? No, c4. Is this like a perk position? Ah, this is very weird. I might actually learn this. This looks really interesting, and it doesn't look like it's an actual opening. Huh, anyway, I might make an opening course on that at some point. That'd be interesting. My opponent goes e4. So I go d5, of course the Caro Kann, and most people go for the advance variation. Now, typically the advance is considered the best way for white to fight for an advantage. But I don't know. I don't know. I mean, maybe the knight c3 is a better way, but I've been recently playing the g6 line here, the Gurganitsa. And I got like some mixed reviews on the Gurganitsa in the last video that I played in it. Now, in that game, my opponent actually took on d5, which, as you can see from the eval bar, is not the correct way for white to play the position. But I've played this a few times recently, and most people take on d5, which is very interesting, and just go for like this kind of setup, which the whole point of the Gurganitsa, by the way, is that the knight is on c3. So you immediately target the d4 pawn. You don't take on d4, allowing the knight to take. And the knight is misplaced, because this pawn should really be going to c3 to support the d4 pawn, or to c4 to attack my d5 pawn. But because of this, and bishop g4 is the main line, trying to pin the knight to remove a defender, and then you play moves like knight c6 to go after the pawn, it's very difficult for white to move this knight and play c3, because that's a lot of tempo to spend on defending a pawn. And then I could play e5 anyway. But it's a really interesting position. I really hoped my opponent would go for it, but we have the advanced variation instead. Now here, g6 isn't such a good idea, because my opponent doesn't have the knight on c3. So he can do like c4 or c3, and his center is completely fine. So c5 immediately, attacking the center. My opponent goes c3. Which is okay, but after knight to c6, you really need to be playing the move bishop to b5 as the white pieces here. Because what you want me to do, basically, is after, like, take, you don't want me to put my bishop on g4. You either want me to play the move e6, and then you play the move knight to f3, and I don't have bishop to g4, or you want me to put my bishop on f5, and then play knight to f3. And then the computer really likes ideas of bishop g4 here for black, just wasting a full move. Although it looks like, apparently knight f3 isn't actually that good. Apparently you've got to take and then go knight c3. The Caro Kann's weird. It's really difficult to play for white, I think. But knight f3 is the most principled move, right? Because I play c5, attacking your center with a pawn. You play c3, defending your center with a pawn. I go knight c6, attacking your center with a knight. You go knight f3, defending your center with a knight. It's like the most intuitive move, and I'm already slightly better here after white plays the most intuitive approach. It's one of the reasons I love the Caro Kann. So you take on d4. You don't want to go bishop to g4 first, because white has the option to take on c5 then, and he's slightly better. So instead you take first. Knight takes can't be played because the e5 pawn hangs. So white has to take with the c pawn. And after bishop g4, bishop e2 is fine, but I think bishop to b5 or bishop to e3 is a little bit more testing for white. Or maybe even knight bd2, but probably bishop e3, then knight bd2. Bishop e2 is fine, but it's passive. We go e6, and I mean, this is just perfect. a3 is played, and you can see the computer hates it. Puts it to, you know, minus 0.5 sort of territory now. We go knight g to e7, which actually isn't the best move. Although, the computer says that queen b6, knight g to e7, and bishop takes f3 are all good moves. And they all kind of transpose anyway. So I honestly don't think it matters very much. We go knight g to e7. My opponent plays bishop g5, which is a mistake. Apparently taking on f3 and then playing queen b6 is doable, but we go queen b6 straight away. And white has so many problems. Like I said earlier in the game, it looks like after playing the move c3 and c takes d4, so all the way back here, after the move c3 is played, it looks like after cd4, cd4, the center is fine. But as we find 1, 2, 3, 4, like 3.5 moves later, the center is not fine. It is most definitely not fine. And my opponent goes b4, which is not a good move. Knight bd2 is a bit better. Now, my opponent was clearly concerned about me taking on b2, but black never wants to take on b2 here because of rook b1, and you're just going to lose the b7 pawn, and this is a little bit concerning, because if b7 falls as well, this diagonal gets weakened massively because our stronghold on c6 is compromised. So, if a move like knight bd2 is played, what would you play here with the black pieces, if not queen takes b2? Think about it. I will tell you, but like, what would you play, right? Knight f5. That's the plan all along. This bishop is kind of obsolete now. I mean, you're kind of stopping me from playing bishop e7 because you might trade. But how are you defending the d4 pawn? If you play a move like knight b3, I mean, sure, you can do that. I mean, I could just go snatch the pawn up and there's nothing you can do about it. Computer likes bishop to e7, but I would honestly not play that because you're kind of just making things really unnecessarily complicated now. The computer wants king e7, and I mean, the king's safe because this diagonal's fine and nothing's getting on the c-file because black will control the c-file, and this pawn is going to fall, but you don't need to make it so complicated. If this were to happen, just take. Keep things nice and easy. Nice and easy. Let this bishop be misplaced. My opponent gets concerned, though, and plays the move b4. And I did consider the move knight to f5 here, playing that first, and trying to say, well, this pawn's going to fall anyway. But yeah, I was correct. Knight bd2 kind of makes it a bit less bad for white, because if my queen ends up on d4, the rook will now be defended. The way that we did it, though, with bishop f3 immediately, bishop f3, queen d4, white has no option other than to trade queens, because the rook is hanging, and if you play a move like knight d2, cutting the connection and making sure the rook is defended, then I would just win another pawn. And it's even worse than that, because if bishop e3, can't I just play d4? Oh, there's knight c4 here. Huh. So knight f5 anyway, and this bishop is not in good shape. Bishop d6 threatening mate, g3, knight e3, f3, e3, queen e3. We're up 3 pawns. Our king is completely safe once it castles, and white is falling apart. So the queen has to take on d4. Knight takes d4, and our opponent finds the best move with bishop d1. Kind of the only move to continue playing the game, because I've got 2 threats. Let's say my opponent castles, so that this doesn't work. Well, I just take the bishop. And then I play a move like, I don't know, knight f5 or knight g6. Even knight c6 is good. White has nothing. He just has nothing. I'm going to own the c-file, right? If white plays... Well, it's not white's move, sorry. So knight c6, I don't know. If b5, you just hang a pawn. If you play f4, the bishop is cut out from the game. Rook c8, if rook c1, I mean h6, bishop h4, bishop e7, take. And we kind of get what we got in the game. And as we saw from the game, it's completely winning. But it's even worse, because in the game, white still had their light-squared bishop, which was their only chance. Here, there's no light-squared bishop, and the structure is worse. So my opponent finds bishop d1, which is a good find. We go knight e to c6, which is the second best move, I think. Knight g6 and knight c6 are kind of interchangeable. a5 is also a move, which I probably should have considered, because if the pawn moves, I can just take it. Although, no, I can't, because of bishop to a4. So knight g6 attacking, and if f4, h6, oh, the bishop can't retreat. I actually missed that. Idea. I should have seen that. Anyway, I'm sure someone will point it out to me in the comment section. Knight e to c6. We support our knight, and we attack the center. f4 defends the pawn. We go bishop e7. h6 was also good, followed by g5, which I did consider. If like take, bishop g7, I'm going to win this pawn. But why give white a passed h-pawn and, you know, make my king a bit unsafe? I saw no point in that because I was like, well, the bishops could like crisscross applesauce me a little bit. And yeah, it's probably fine, but like, there's no need. Just go bishop e7. Personally, I think bishop e7 is the best move here. The computer says no, h6 in this complicated line is better. But I'm a human, you're a human, right? From a human perspective, bishop e7 is easy because white has no choice. White has to exchange. Otherwise, I'm going to take, and take. Sorry, take, and take. If you play a move like h4, I have f6. And if this, knight f5 and your bishop's trapped. So you have to trade. You have to trade with me. King e7. The king is safe on e7, as we saw in the game. The king was involved in the action, and it was never in danger once. Never in danger once. King e7. Castles. Rook a to c8. a5 the computer slightly preferred. Yeah, I suppose if b5 I just take it. And then what else can white do other than takes? And then this is a bit of an issue. I think I didn't do this because I didn't like the b-file opening up against my pawn, but I suppose the bishop and the knight still don't really have any good squares to go to let a rook get to b1. Rook ac8 is still great, though. Knight c3. We go knight to f5. Not the best move, but does the job. Bishop a4 is played by my opponent. I was more... Well, g4 here makes my life dead easy. Again, the computer wants white to do this, but then white is just absolutely lost if I take on d1. You know, the computer likes knight c4, but I take on d1 every day here. And we're just up a pawn. But it's so much worse than that, because I've got tactics like this, and even if I don't have tactics like that, let's just say I play, I don't know, h5, and then g5, and I still don't take on here. Let's say I play a6, and my opponent plays like knight a4. I still think this is completely winning. Although I don't know why the computer wants to allow this. a5. Yeah, I suppose that makes sense. And if takes, we counterattack. I think this is very easy for black. f4 is going to be a permanent weakness as well. Bishop a4 is played. I take on b4, which actually is an inaccuracy. Wow. Knight c to d4 is better. Oh! Because you can't play rook c1. Because take, check. The idea that I also saw. Oh, wow. So you have to move the knight. And then knight e2. King f2. And then I just win the f4 pawn. Okay, so what about if the king goes to h1? There are funny ideas of doing this to exchange two knights for the rook. But of course, there's no point doing that. a6... The knight has to come forward. And then can't we just trap it? Yeah, we can just trap the knight. That's really interesting. And we control the c1 square as well. Huh. I take on b4 though, which, not gonna lie, I think is a bit easier. Less complicated. And bishop a4, because the reason I didn't go knight to b4 here, well, rook b1 apparently exists, but here, one of my rooks is going to have to be a bit passive now to defend this pawn, and I didn't really want to do that. But once the bishop comes to a4, I'm much more comfortable going for this, because if take, the game is basically over. I mean, white has nothing. Absolutely nothing. My knight is so much better than this bishop. I'm 2 pawns up, protected past pawn. I'm going to double on the c-file, 2v1 advantage on the queen side. Completely winning. My opponent finds the best move with knight b5. We find the best move with knight back to c6, just defending this pawn. And here I expected the move g4, trying to get my knight to move somewhere so that knight d6 could be played. And if I was to play inaccurately, as you can see, I'm still winning, but I'm far less winning because this knight is a very good piece. Instead of g4, I was going to play, I think, either knight to e3 or knight to d4. If knight d4, knight d6... Nah, this is ugly. I think I'd probably go for this. And then if, like, rook e1, there's knight c4 protecting d6, and if bishop b3, I have this. And if take, then this knight can't be dislodged. The knight defends the square. If the knight takes, maybe I take with the rook. And if knight here, I win the f4 pawn, yeah. And these are very weak. So if the rook defends, g5, okay, I'm never really going to play g5. f6, I don't think I'd play that. b6 maybe makes a bit more sense. What's wrong with... Oh, doubling just hangs a fork. Although, black is still winning. Anyway, my opponent doesn't play g4, which I thought was his best chance. He goes rook a to c1, and like I said, it's just a bit of a lazy move, because now we play a6, we kick the knight away, and we have no concerns. I go b5, kicking the bishop, but my opponent sacks the knight. Now, I can't blame him for doing this, because the problem for white is if the bishop moves, any square he goes to, I can attack him with my knight. If the bishop goes to d1, no, not that. If the bishop goes to d1, I can play knight e3, and this is really uncomfortable. Like, this rook is doing a lot of work here. The rook is under attack. This is horrific. And my knights are absolute monsters in my opponent's territory. If bishop to a2, then I just take here, and I give this check. It's absolutely dire. Bishop d1 kind of has to be played to stop these tactics. So my opponent instead decides to take on b5, which the computer doesn't hate, to be fair, but it's still losing. A b5, bishop b5. We go knight cd4, attacking the bishop, offering a rook trade. My opponent retreats the bishop. Here it doesn't make sense to take. You can see the eval drop like a few points. I mean, black's still winning, of course, but it's just a bit more difficult now. It's a bit more difficult for no reason. I go king d7 instead, just defending my c-file, preparing to exchange all the rooks. Let's say white plays a move like h3 here. Rook c1, rook c1, rook c8. And white struggles because I get back on the c-file. And if you try to avoid the trade, I can bring the king over, but I think better is just a move like knight c6. And if you try to infiltrate, I just block. You have to go back. And everything's coming together. My knights are moving over to the queen side. The a-pawn will be lost, and the game will be over. My opponent goes rook b1. The game is not over yet. Of course, we are up a whole knight. But this bishop is good, because it can monitor the queen side, and the king side, and the center all at once. My knights can't do that, and they're kind of tripping over each other a little bit. And this a-pawn is annoying. These rooks are potentially going to be annoying against my king, so we have to be accurate. I play rook b8, offering a trade. My opponent plays a4, which is a good move. The computer likes the idea of exchanging and then going rook a8, but I don't see the point in allowing anything like this. A computer can play like this. I think it would be irresponsible for a human to play like this. That's my personal opinion. Knight c6 is the best move, though. Wait. Yeah, the computer changed its mind. Now it thinks knight c6 is the best move. And I love this move, because it defends, and it's just great. If the bishop comes to b5, then the other knight just goes to d4. And what's white doing here? If he moves rook f2? Okay, I suppose. I can just take, and if take, just put the other knight on d4, no? a7's apparently better, but that's very passive, so probably knight d4. And this pawn is an issue. This pawn is a big issue. It's gonna fall. My opponent takes on f5 though, which, yes, it damages my structure, but that's about all it does. He still has all the same issues. After rook fd1, we just push. Now, maybe I should have taken here first. But again, I don't really want to let the rook in for no reason. Even if I'm fine, I don't really want to allow that. So instead, I just push. And here I'm thinking that I have no problems, because my opponent's got to try and push this pawn. But rook b4, best move. Attacking, defending. Pawn pushes. Rook a8, the pawn has to push again. Rook b6, the pawn has to push again. And here, don't take. Don't take. Because white can win my dangerous pawn. And the d-pawn is the reason that I won the game sooner rather than later. Avoiding any unnecessary complications. If I lose this pawn, I'm still winning. But I'm going to have to work a bit harder for it. Whereas rook b7 means that my knight keeps defending this pawn. The computer liked rook b4, defending with the rook and then taking on a7 with the rook, but I don't think it matters. Rook a4, we take on a7 with the b rook. Because after rook c4, we offer a trade, and white can't refuse. So take, king f2, rook a2 check, king g3. We make sure the king has to keep an eye on his kingside pawns, because if he comes forward, we will just take. So the king goes to g3, it's kind of out of the game, and now we push. There is no rook d4 check, so the rook goes to c3, we push again, rook d3. And here, the computer says that this is fine, because after rook d6, king e7, you can't take because I promote. But we're going to have to figure out how to win anyway, right? Dancing like this is kind of a waste of our time. So better, I think, is king e7 immediately. Now, king f2, of course, just loses the game because we promote with check, and it's apparently mate in 2, no matter what my opponent does. If the king goes up, we have mate. And if you block, then the king goes up, and we have mate. So what could my opponent have done instead? Well, I was thinking maybe king f3. Because let's say, I don't know. Oh, rook a3 is a move. Wow. Pinning the rook to the king and forcing the pawn through. That's interesting. That's really cool. But let's say I play a move like knight b4. And rook d6. And, I don't know. Let's just say I do nothing. Then the king can go to e2. And I can't promote with discovered check because the king just takes the queen, right? There are better moves here for white. Sorry, for black. Rook a3, maybe trying to go rook d3, I think. And if rook takes, knight takes, the king can't take the knight because I promote. So if you take here, I just go and win everything. But king f2 makes the game simple. King f3 keeps it a little bit interesting. But my opponent blunders, we take full advantage of it, and my opponent resigns. The Caro Kann is a beast for an opening. I love it so much. I love making videos on it. If you want to learn more about it, check out the video that's appearing here for a really cool Caro Kann game, or the playlist, oh my god, the playlist appearing here for every game I've ever played in the Caro Kann. Thank you for watching.